Hello, Bible readers. Well, we are truly near the end of our deep dive into Revelation. Today's post is going to consider the last judgment, and then I'm going to get toward, finally, the New Jerusalem. Professor Eugene Boring notes that Revelation, chapter 20, verses 11 to 15, this is the only judgment scene John knows. Everyone is there. He says, so here is a good test for our interpretive procedure of dealing with each visionary scene individually as one way of picturing the final victory of God, without feeling any more compulsion than John himself does to fit the scenes together into a super picture, a consistent, comprehensive, end of times program. I start most of these posts by saying something like this, right? That each vision is its own piece of art, which may or may not overlap, agree, or contradict with the other pieces of art in this museum that is themed around the end. The Last Judgment is vision number 6. And although the Scofield Reference Bible and proponents of the rapture would say that there are 7 judgments, John only names the one, this one. Of course, the mistake happens when you read this apocalyptic letter as though it is a systematic theology text. John is not teaching any system here. He is espousing no coherent, all-encompassing theological explanation for all things. John is just pulling metaphors from his tradition, from the myths of his era, from the myths of his region, all in order to provide pastoral clarity to the churches in Asia. That's it. That's all he's trying to do. That's the why for John. That Revelation was put in our Bible a couple hundred years later was so that these word pictures of John could perhaps encourage us to hope like John hoped, like he hoped his churches in Asia would hope. If you read this apocalyptic letter as though it needs to make chronological sense, as though there is a plot where one paragraph is building on the last paragraph, then you're going to get confused. And that's what happens to rapture believers. Imagine reading chapter 20, verse 5, where John talks about the first resurrection. Please see my previous post on the first resurrection if you haven't already. But if you think that picture of what we call the millennium, the 1,000 years, if you think that picture of the millennium in the art museum is only part of a larger picture that now includes this last judgment, verses 11 to 15, well, then you'd have to do some scriptural gymnastics, right? So if the faithful Christians were raised in the first resurrection, you might think, to reign with Christ at the beginning of the 1,000 years, then those who John is talking about in verse 12, which is a whole new vision, but those who John is talking about in verse 12, the dead standing before the throne, they would have to be all non-Christians who didn't get resurrected in the first go-round. So this must be the second resurrection, a second judgment. And so maybe this second judgment is done on different terms than the first judgment, since these are all non-Christians. Like, our interpretations of everything are going to get a whole lot messier if we try to synthesize these 7 visions of the end. These visions are not linear. They are not a system. John is not trying to have all these pictures agree or even connect. Revelation is so much richer, so much more layered, so much more complex and mysterious than the simplicity some of us seek, as though John simply has one answer for us, and here's how it always goes for everybody. As for the 6th vision itself, notice that it's not like there's some scary God judge next to some compassionate, friendly Jesus. God and the Lamb are one somehow. The Lamb is never some independent figure for John, but always Lamb as representative of God. And God is always defined with Christ, never apart from Christ. It's always God defined by Christ on the cross. Oftentimes, Christians talk about the Trinity like, well, you got the God judge does this, there's all that wrath and whatever, while Savior Jesus, the Lamb, does this, and it's all saving, and what a friend we have. But John doesn't think like that at all. He definitely doesn't use words to support that at all. Instead, he uses words to make pictures, and in this sixth picture of the end, he shows us books, plural, books. It is typical in apocalyptic tradition that people are judged by what they've done. Very works righteous, you could say. This obviously elevates human freedom and human responsibility in that everything we do matters. It all goes in a book. Forever in this picture. And I saw the dead, John says, and books were opened. Kind of an expected thing for listeners in the first century. That's what this judgment scene would look like from other apocalyptic stories. That would have been a predictable way for this apocalyptic story to be told. But then John says, also another book was opened. I think listeners would have been like, so what's that now? The book of life. So not only does this picture take our actions very seriously, it also takes God's grace very seriously. Both of these books are there. So in this picture, I would stand before the throne and there would be two books opened for me. My life in one, there's a lot of stuff in there that I'd be like, turn the page, turn the page. And Jesus' death and resurrection in the other. It is a paradox. And with any good biblical paradox, we must hold both things at the same time. If we let one go, the other drops also. Boring wants to be clear, though, for all the grace that John adds to an otherwise predictable throne room judgment scene, you can't deny that a separation happens at the end of history. There is a scene of damnation for the unfaithful also, but I'll have more to say about that in my last post, which will consider universal salvation. Before I get there, though, the end of this post, and an entire 2 more posts are going to need to go to the 7th vision of the end, the New Jerusalem. I mean, it is what the whole letter has been driving toward, so it's worthy of a little time. It is by far the largest and the most detailed of John's pictures of the end. This is what John has been preparing us for. It's like taking a tour of our church here at First Lutheran, and I'll show people the fellowship hall and the Sunday school classrooms and all the nice things, but I always finish by bringing them into the sanctuary, where they get to see and feel that big, beautiful window of the Good Shepherd and all the other things that space does. For John, he puts this New Jerusalem vision last because he wants it to last in the memories of those who hear this letter. Like most of his visions, he does not conjure this vision up from the depths of his own mind. The idea of a heavenly Jerusalem becoming the ultimate home of the people of God, well, that can be found in a number of other parts of the New Testament, in Galatians, for example, Philippians, Hebrews, and the descent of the holy city on the last day, accomplished by God apart from human works. That's something that Psalm 46 envisions, as well as Isaiah 2. And actually, a lot of the images in this vision are biblical. God's throne, seeing the face of God, the tree of life, gold and jeweled construction, golden streets, pearly gates, all these and more are drawn from the Old Testament. And that's why this letter would have felt familiar and new. By highlighting a holy city, John is also drawing on the values of his own era as well. Greek and Roman dreams and philosophies about the ideal way of life. Like we can resonate with this as Americans. We talk about a belief in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we're trying to strive toward those ideals. Well, what if John got a hold of those? He'd almost certainly use that familiarity for us and then reimagine it for how God regards that to be true for all, how God will fulfill that somehow. So John creates a picture of a new Jerusalem that fulfills all human dreams for the community and security of life in an ideal city. Like, what if God was mayor of a city? What if a city itself was holy, which means other? I'm going to talk more about that and a few other essential details about what John means in my next post. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.